The BASF Dispersions and Resins Product Stewardship team is back again with another episode of Sustainability and Stewardship Matters podcast to discuss a product regulatory and sustainability topic that is important to those working in the chemical industry. I'm Hannah Bleecker, Product Steward for Dispersions and podcast co-host.
And I'm Lindsey Foster, Product Steward for Resins in North America and podcast co-host. In today's episode, we're covering the status of microplastics regulations and science. Our guests today are Jeanne Hankett, BASF's subject matter expert on microplastics, and Jennifer Holtz, who is our registration specialist for dispersions and resins. Welcome, Jennifer and Jeanne. Would you please tell us a little bit more about yourselves?
Hello. Thank you for including me in this important discussion today. My name is Jennifer Holtz, and I'm a product registration specialist for resins and dispersions at BASF. I help to advocate for transparent, science-based microplastic regulation and risk management controls. I also have experience in quantifying microplastics using analytical techniques such as pyrolysis GC mass spec. I'm happy to be with you today to discuss the topic of microplastics.
And hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. My name is Jeanne Hankett. I'm BASF Corporation's microplastic subject matter expert, as mentioned, and I manage our North American Biodegradation and Microplastics Center of Excellence located in Wyandotte, Michigan. To give our listeners some information on my technical background, I first started researching microplastics over 12 years ago near the end of my PhD. And today I work with a wide swath of talented BASF colleagues and external stakeholders to advance the science of microplastics and for us to generate solutions to enable a polymeric circular economy. I'm really looking forward to chatting with all of you about microplastics.
Thanks, Jennifer and Jeanne. This is such a hot topic and there are so many points to cover, but I would like to start the conversation on what we consider a microplastic to be and what it isn't. There really isn't a consensus on the definition of a microplastic currently. Can you explain a little bit why that is?
Yes, Lindsey, this is an excellent question to kick us off. Many of our listeners may have heard significantly different versions of what a microplastic is defined as. And there's a simple reason to answer why. The science of microplastics is relatively new. 20 years ago, the term barely existed. But in the past couple years, we have made some progress in global agreement of the defined scope of a microplastic. So if I can get into some technical talk then, when we go to the basics for any scientific definition of a material, we have to define the material's root origin. So in short, a microplastic is a solid plastic particle between roughly 1 micron to 5 millimeters in size by any of its 3 dimensions. This in itself describes a wide swath of materials. So if you can imagine, 1 micron is smaller than the human eye can see, and 5 millimeters is about the size of a pencil eraser.
And I will add that there are 2 categories of microplastics based on their source, primary and secondary microplastics. That much has been well accepted globally.
Yes, exactly.
Primary microplastics are those that start their life cycle at the size ranges Jeanne mentioned. So for example, pre-production pellets. Secondary microplastics are formed in the environment through the life cycle of a larger plastic piece. For example, when a plastic bottle breaks down into small pieces.
Absolutely. You'll commonly see the categories of primary and secondary microplastics referred to either separately or together, depending on the application topic. And to make things a bit more complicated, we can't forget to mention microfibers in this mix.
Yes, of course. Plastic microfibers. Microplastics that have a length to width ratio of greater than 3. Most often this is referring to plastic textile fibers. If you can imagine, this means that there are many different forms of microplastics, different sizes, different shapes, different chemistries, and alterations from different exposures to the environment.
Billions of different combinations.
Yes, this fact clearly shows that there is a second reason why it is so difficult to define microplastics over the years. The number of materials covered under this umbrella is enormous.
Wow, that gets complicated very quickly. And the sheer array of materials covered sounds a little overwhelming to regulate. But I appreciate you making the distinction between primary and secondary microplastics and the sheer magnitude of the topic at hand. This, in my opinion, really highlights the importance of having a good definition to focus regulations.
And when we get back to your question of why there isn't a single universal definition, you can imagine the details surrounding the microplastics definition can vary widely depending on the application. What is the lower size limit, for example? When is something a microplastic versus a nanoplastic? At what sizes do solid polymer particles cease to be solids and turn into waxes or non-solid materials? Which really is a fascinating fundamental physics question that we haven't quite answered. And what types of microplastics are important to the topic at hand?
Well, ladies, that sounds both tedious and fascinating. The basic scope certainly helps set us up for further discussion. Let's jump then to some different proposed definitions of microplastics globally. The term derogations is often used in relation to regulations and policy. For example, last year, the American Chemistry Council proposed a specific definition to the state of California that indicates it's 1, a plastic of a certain size, 2, that it isn't biodegradable, or 3, water soluble, and 4, it must contain carbon atoms. What factors would support these derogations, and what makes for a suitable microplastic definition for regulatory applications?
I love this question, Hannah. It's a great example of how important sound scientific definitions are for public policy and regulations in terms of downstream applications. Jen and I have worked on this topic often. In all cases, providing appropriate qualifiers to define a microplastic within a designated framework is critical to advance quality science and to generate a reasonable scope for regulations, labeling, and market requirements.
Interesting. What do you mean when you say appropriate qualifiers there? Does that include derogations?
Yes, absolutely. Derogations are not just about eliminating materials or products from the scope of regulation. Derogations allow us to ensure that the definition of a microplastic is both inclusive and narrow enough for future regulations and policies to focus on the appropriate materials, especially when we talk about hazard and risk.
Can you give us an example of how that might work?
Certainly. Jen, I'll hand that one over to you, as I know you have a great explanation and example for this topic.
Thanks, Jeanne. Happy to. Hannah, you mentioned one important derogation already, biodegradable microplastics. This group of plastics differs from traditional plastics primarily in their composition and degradation processes. Biodegradable plastics are often made from renewable resources and designed to break down more quickly, consumed by a naturally occurring collection of microbes under controlled conditions, while traditional plastics are typically derived from petrochemicals and can persist for hundreds of years. This ultimately means that risk evaluations and exposure assessments for traditional plastics don't often apply to biodegradable plastics. This is one of the main reasons why biodegradable plastics were derogated from Europe's recent synthetic polymer microparticle restriction.
Definitely. Despite such key differences, we do see that not all proposed definitions have appropriate scope and derogations for microplastics, again, likely because the science and the concept of microplastics is relatively new, and not all information on appropriate scoping of new regulation is readily accessible.
Very interesting. And that makes a lot of sense from a practical standpoint. In your opinion, can we expect to see harmonization in the future?
In a few words, I would say both yes and no. Many global and regional organizations, including governments, standard organizations, and industry trade organizations, have made significant progress in generating more harmonization between regional definitions. It's certainly my hope that in the next couple of years, we'll have improved alignment globally. But it's also important to mention that the details for microplastics definitions really matter. There will not likely be a single definition that is applicable for all regulations, policies, scientific studies, and so on, simply because the applications of the definitions differ and the regional needs or legislative goals, so for example, regional specific terms or market or regulatory concerns, will be different.
Understood. That makes a lot of sense when we break it down to the basics. Since we're chatting about applications, it seems like a good time to switch gears to the topic of dispersions and resins and the lens of microplastic.
All right, we're ready.
Good. The dispersion and resins business sells chemical formulations to a variety of formulators. Our products are used in applications such as paints and coatings, adhesives, and floor polishes. What have been the regulatory trends for microplastics related to these products?
I'm happy to take this question on.
Yes, go for it.
Most proposed regulations, bans, or labeling requirements to date focus on primary microplastics rather than secondary microplastics, which is more of an emerging topic.
Yes, secondary microplastics regulations are emerging, and we have questions about this later involving state legislation.
This is likely true because it's far easier to regulate primary microplastics intentionally added to products rather than secondary microplastics, which are part of plastic waste. Here's what gets interesting. In Europe, we're seeing the regulation of synthetic polymer microparticles, not necessarily microplastics as we've defined earlier. This risk management regulation, known as the EU REACH, Restriction on Synthetic Polymer Microparticles, which is abbreviated SPM, entered into force in October 2023, and it applies only to primary synthetic polymer materials added to cosmetics, detergents, and waxes, and other product categories. The REACH SPM restriction specifically prohibits placing on the European market SPMs as substances on their own or in mixtures in a concentration equal to or greater than 0.01% by weight. It also sets out transitional periods for manufacturers and users of SPM regarding their obligations to inform customers about precautionary measures to avoid releases into the environment. The restriction exempts from the ban polymer microparticles that qualify as natural polymers, excluding those manufactured industrially, which are biodegradable, have a solubility greater than 2 grams per liter, or do not contain carbon atoms.
The latest I heard is that paints and coatings were excluded from the definition as an SPM under REACH. Is this your understanding as well?
Well, most paints and coatings in the scope of this legislation do not meet the definition of a synthetic polymer microparticle because the polymers in the formulation are not solid. By definition, synthetic polymer microparticles are solid, and they are either contained in particles or they build a continuous surface coating on particles, like coated titanium dioxide. There are some resins, such as those used in certain floor polish products, that are considered solid synthetic polymer microparticles under the EU REACH definition. However, these products may qualify for a derogation if the SPM are converted during application into a film, which no longer meets the definition of a SPM. There are reporting and labeling obligations for users and manufacturers of derogated SPM.
Thank you for that overview, Jen. I really appreciate how you made the distinction that materials with a derogation might not be banned, but may still have regulatory requirements to follow, such as reporting. Overall, I think this is a really great example of how regulations, specifically definitions and derogations, can evolve over time and as new information is received. Shifting our focus to public perception, when the public thinks about microplastics, most typically think of secondary microplastics and microplastic waste. Let's dig into this topic a little bit further as societal awareness on microplastics has really started to increase in the past several years. It's a topic that's commonly reported in the news and even discussed on social media.
Yes, Lindsey, I just saw multiple studies highlighted in the news, and it seems research is accelerating. It certainly seems like microplastics are ubiquitous in our lives, and the common discussion is often linked to plastic pollution. Is there a disconnect between society's understanding of microplastics and the plastic pollution topic, Jeanne?
Thanks for bringing this up. I would say yes, there are some missing pieces of information when it comes to the topic of microplastics shared with the public, and some common misconceptions about the relationship between microplastics and plastic pollution. The typical discussions on microplastics involve secondary microplastics, which makes sense from an exposure perspective, as they account for more than 99% of all microplastics on Earth. but often the discussion focuses on results from individual novel studies regarding potential exposure to humans and organisms and/or potential hazards. As a result, as consumers, we typically see information piecemeal and often hear about the latest debates on microplastics in single data points or single studies. The complex picture as to how secondary microplastics relate to plastic pollution is often lost. It's important to note also that the discussion of microplastic waste escaping into the environment shouldn't stop here. Secondary microplastics exposure is only a part of the larger plastic pollution topic. And the best way to reduce exposure to secondary microplastics in the environment is to prevent their formation in the first place.
I would agree wholeheartedly. So, are there means to prevent microplastic waste in the environment then?
I think it's good to mention here that we are driving toward a more circular economy. For our listeners, a polymeric circular economy is an economic model that emphasizes the sustainable use, recycling, and recovery of polymer materials, aiming to minimize waste and maximize resource efficiency. In this model, the life cycle of a polymer is extended through strategies such as design for recyclability, effective collection and sorting systems, and innovative recycling techniques.
Certainly. And while there's no magic bullet for the polymeric circular economy, there are many innovations that exist and are actively being improved or in the making by some of the world's most brilliant scientists and engineers to enable these circular mechanisms. I should be clear on my end, these are extremely difficult and complex challenges to solve. But iterative improvements and breakthroughs are being made every day. Between biodegradables, mechanical recycling, advanced recycling, and bio-based materials, the future is looking brighter.
Agreed, Jeanne. In the context of circular plastics economy, we should also consider controlled end of life. And I think it's important to discuss this in the context of the product's intended purpose. Certain products are designed with durability in mind. For example, it's critical that an architectural or industrial coating is long-lasting.
To add to this, coatings are versatile and can be used in many different applications, but a coating product's longevity is designed to support the end uses of the finished products to which it gets applied. As you've mentioned, Hannah, some coatings are intended to stand up to the elements and the test of time. Others are intended to break down more easily in systems like those used at recycling or composting facilities, as we've seen in adhesives and paper markets. As we consider this topic from the perspective of dispersions and resins, our products are used in various coating applications, including architectural, industrial, paper, and adhesives. Jeanne, could you provide some examples of innovations that might help mitigate the release of microplastics into the environment in these areas?
Sure. In all cases, product design for end of life should be included during the R&D phase of dispersions and resins. This means understanding the expected lifetime of the material's applications and the method for its end of life disposal or reuse. For example, innovations to prevent microplastic at its source could involve adding a barrier coating to single-use products like paper cups, using compostable or degradable coating materials to better ensure that these single-use paper cups do not persist in the environment. Innovations can also help to address microplastic generation at a product's end of life. A polymeric coating that enhances the durability of a material can help to reduce the need for regular product replacement, thereby reducing both the quantity of waste disposed and any microplastics that would have been generated as it degrades.
These are all really cool applications and examples. I will mention that outside of dispersions and resins, mechanical recycling is applicable to certain types of plastics, advanced recycling for others, and biodegradation appropriate for specific situations where the material has a controlled end of life, such as in farming or composting.
These are all really fascinating points. And I personally know dozens of colleagues working on these sorts of innovations and agree that we have many more future breakthroughs to look forward to. One thing that comes to mind as we talk about the plastic pollution topic, I'd like to ask maybe one of the most important questions to me. We're all science-minded, all heavily invested in sustainability, and at the end of the day, we're also all consumers. So I'd really like to know what the current science says about physical chemical properties of microplastics, the health and safety aspects, and then about the solutions to address microplastic pollution. Jeanne, you were the sustainability lead of our North America Center of Excellence Biodegradation and Microplastics Lab, and microplastics has been at the forefront of your research and advocacy efforts. So what are your thoughts about microplastics or microparticles?
So many great subtopics to dive into from these questions. Okay, let's start with the general thoughts about microplastics. They constitute intriguing, fascinating subject matter. And I say this because we're in what I like to call the toddler phase of research from a global perspective. We're past our infancy, but now we're toddling around, and there aren't a lot of quality control rules to rein us in. Over the past 15 years or so, we've made a lot of discoveries, but largely we've used what the World Health Organization has aptly described in their 2022 Micro and Nanoplastics Dietary and Inhalation Report, bespoke methods and techniques to make these discoveries. So what does this mean? At this point, it inherently means that we have collected a lot of data on microplastics. So I no longer say that we're in our infancy, as I mentioned previously, but we're still toddling along when it comes to understanding risk and hazard for microplastics at a holistic level. Now, the good news is, about 15 years ago, the discovery of the prevalence of microplastics was a bit of a sky is falling moment for researchers. Many of us feared the worst for negative health impacts and trophic accumulation. And in the years that follow, the science has indicated potentially fewer environmental impacts for microplastics than we first feared. But here's the interesting part again. Lack of high quality studies have not allowed us to make many conclusions about hazard and risk. There's evidence that plastic microfibers are likely a contributing factor in increased respiratory distress, especially for individuals susceptible to asthma or for those that have pre-existing respiratory issues. Specific types of microplastics can increase overall oxidative cellular stress. That's also been conclusively demonstrated in select studies. But at the same time, very little is understood on microplastics hazards, as toxicological studies are often performed for a narrow class of materials. And studies of high enough quality to be used for risk and hazard assessment are still lacking. Now, I haven't even gotten into the debates for proper methods to extract and to analyze microplastics or how to fill the data gaps surrounding the different interactions between different types of microplastics and living organisms.
That's a great point that much more needs to be done in research to answer these questions. You provide such a great visualization that we're not at the very beginning of studying microplastics and their impacts on health and environment, but we are still learning more about what to do. Can you talk a bit more about what we know right now based on the current data? What does the science say about the physical and chemical aspect of microplastics?
Yes. So I mentioned bespoke methods here earlier, and it's important to caveat our conversation with the fact that scientific teams have not traditionally had technologies, methods, or means to tackle a complex class of materials like microplastics. Microplastics have both diverse physical attributes and chemical compositions. So both categories present challenges for developing robust standard methodologies for sampling, for analysis, and for quality metrics. Standard methodologies are still being developed globally and are currently rarely applied in microplastic research. Now, that being said, the bulk of credible research indicates that size, shape, and chemical composition of microplastics greatly impacts its potential interactions with living organisms. A spherical polystyrene microplastic may interact with cells much differently than a jagged polyethylene particle or a polyester microfiber due to the surface chemistry and other physical chemistry attributes. Not all microplastics are created equally when it comes to determining potential health impacts.
So how do we know that information? What combinations of characteristics can induce different health effects?
Well, Lindsey, I can only speak generally to answer this question as a non-expert in toxicology or physics, but in summary, no. We don't know because those studies have not yet been performed. There are many scientists who believe that combined effects, like heterogeneous combination of microplastics and other natural matter as an example, need to be studied in addition to or in lieu of some of the more common homogeneous studies. Most of the studies to date have been performed on polystyrene microbeads because they are commercially available and are well characterized.
And what about the lower size limit that we touched on earlier? Should microplastics having a lower size limit of 1 micron in any dimension be regulated differently than nanoplastics having even smaller size dimensions or below 100 nanometers?
Right. This topic of the lower size limit, I think there are two aspects to chat about here. The first is on the technical feasible lower size limit, and the second is the physical difference between carbon-based particles of different sizes. When we talk about the technical feasible lower size limit, this limit is very important for regulations. Current state-of-the-art robust analytical technologies can chemically identify plastic particles with lower size limits around single microns. As such, ECHA and other organizations have recognized feasible lower size limits to microplastics at 100 nanometers, which gives some wiggle room for theoretically improved analytical technologies over the next years. Beyond this size limit, it gets increasingly difficult to determine, number one, the chemical identity of the polymers, and number two, if the analyte observed is in particle form. Now, to get into the deep science, the crossover from a solid particle to a non-solid at lower sizes for many types of microplastics is still of debate. We're still developing technologies and models to help determine when a nanoplastic is no longer a solid.
Interesting. The definition of solid has been of critical importance in all the regulations. So can you expand a bit more on why?
Jen, I'll pass this one over to you.
Oh, sure. The concept of solid should be defined by a standard organization and demonstrated using standard methodologies. Even with standardization, demonstrating proof of solidity is difficult in the submicron particle size range. Appropriate types of methods to test colloids, dispersions, and emulsions for solidity of particles using minimum film forming temperature should also be considered. We abbreviate minimum film forming temperature with MFFT. The MFFT is the lowest temperature needed to allow polymer droplets to flow together during their separation from water, which is the drying process, forming a continuous film. If polymer droplets flow together without external forces, they must be seen as being liquid because they'd lose their shape. If the polymer droplets do not flow together at a given temperature, they're most likely solid particles.
Thanks for the explanation, Jennifer. I'd like to move on to the regulatory state of affairs. In our last episode, BASF's head of state government affairs identified partnership as the best path forward for regulations at the state level. If you could partner with states or the federal government on microplastics legislation, what would you tell them given the existing science or potential for scientific development?
Oh, what an interesting question, Hannah. And in a moment, I'd like to get deeply nerdy here and dive into the science. But first, given the opportunity to communicate with states, my messaging would emphasize the need at a fundamental level to properly identify what we are dealing with when it comes to the microplastics topics. One of my favorite phrases this year is, "It all starts with the definition," which we have discussed extensively today. I think that this concept cannot be underemphasized, especially at the current stage of regulatory and legislative development in the US.
Meaning that you need to first properly quantify and qualify what we are studying and or regulating before we do so?
Exactly. Now for the nerdy and deep dive part. We're seeing debates for toxicology, hazard, degree of exposure, compartmental sinks for microplastics, and length of their persistence in various environments. The burden of evidence is not yet strong enough for the scientific community to reach many meaningful conclusions. To add to the complexity, the studied materials can differ widely in scope. If we ever want to properly investigate the impacts and life cycles of micro and nanoplastics, we need our researchers to all be speaking similar technical languages, where we clearly define what is being researched. The better we define our topics of interest, the more impactful our science will be, and the more robust the scientific debate and discussion that can occur to provide prevalent theories. This is why a regulatory-related definition that drives researchers to study a topic is important even for scientific ventures.
Such valid points, Jeanne, especially that last one. It's really imperative that everyone is speaking or at least understands the same technical language. This would apply to non-researchers also, such as members of advocacy groups. Who are the main industry advocacy groups that you see are involved in this topic?
Well, Lindsey, from the industry perspective, our trade organizations are quite involved in the microplastics topics. In North America, the American Chemistry Council hosts some of the leading advocacy efforts and supports scientific research on microplastics with academia through their Microplastics Research Consortium. On the global stage, I'd like to highlight one inter-organizational platform, MARI, or the Microplastics Advanced Research and Innovation Initiative, is hosted by the International Council of Chemical Associations as a leading player. MARI functions as a roundtable that brings together scientists in industry and academia to tackle some of the highest impact challenges associated with microplastic science. And MARI also provides a platform for global scientific exchange, including hosting global and regional summits.
Earlier in our discussion, we emphasized the EU legislation and derogations for microparticles. However, plastic pollution and subsequently microplastics has garnered international attention, leading to various legislative proposals and actions around the world. In the United States, for instance, the Save Our Seas Act 2.0 has been passed at the federal level. What parallels can we draw between this act and the EU regulations regarding the treatment of microplastics or microparticles?
From the federal perspective in the U.S., we currently have a more distinct focus on supporting scientific fundamental research than in the European Union. I can say that. Save Our Seas 2.0, for example, charged the U.S. EPA with providing a report on microplastics that includes a definition, recommendations for monitoring and testing of microplastics, and exposure assessments for microplastics in drinking water, among other scientific-related items. From the Save Our Seas 2.0 charge, the Interagency Marine Debris Coordinating Committee report on microfiber pollution was published by NOAA this year. But we don't see much movement at the federal level for any microplastics bans beyond the existing 2015 Microbead Free Waters Act. And in contrast, there are individual movements from state legislatures and regulatory agencies that support research and/or focus on regulation or banning of primary microplastics.
What about Canada? Do we see any regulatory proposal for microplastics out of this region?
In Canada, the actions taken so far are limited to a few types of microplastics. For example, in November 2018, Canada adopted a strategy for zero plastic waste, which helps to address all plastic wasted to the environment. In July of 2019, Canada banned the sale and manufacturing of microbeads in toiletries, which specifically targets primary microplastic pollution. Then, in June of 2022, Canada banned 6 single-use plastic items, which helps to reduce secondary microplastics formed from the breakdown of single-use plastics left in the environment.
In addition to federal legislation and action, we do continue to see action also in the U.S. at the state level. California appears to be leading the effort on microplastics in North America. The DTSC released their draft 2024 to 2026 Priority Product Work Plan for Safer Consumer Products. The goal of the Safer Consumer Products program is to reduce the use of hazardous chemicals in consumer products. Surprisingly, microplastics was included, both as a separate category and as a hazardous substance present in paints. What impact do we expect from this, Jennifer?
The Priority Product Work Plan indicates the agency's continued intention to list microplastics as a chemical of concern on their candidate chemicals list. It also states that the agency is concurrently screening any and all consumer products that can release microplastics, naming paint products as a specific area of interest as a product that can release microplastics. This is significant because it places the generation of secondary microplastics in scope to determine if a consumer product has potential to harm people or the environment, and if the product chemical combination should be regulated as a priority product. DTSC is still working on a microplastic definition in the proposal to add microplastics to the candidate chemicals list. Their timeline indicates plans to publish a notice of proposed action in February 2025, and the comment period will run through mid-March or so. And then DTSC will finalize that regulation by August 2025. The potential impact of this regulation is significant if it's adopted as a template for future legislation, thereby setting a precedent. Now, not all evaluations by DTSC lead to a priority product listing. A risk analysis includes both a chemical's hazard traits as well as an exposure analysis. Decisions are also informed by policy considerations, including how definitive the science is on the topic, how protective other laws and regulations are against any risks to human health and the environment, and whether alternatives are available for the chemical of concern.
Well, one thing is clear. This topic is one that is likely to remain in focus for consumers, legislatures, and industry for years to come. To wrap up our conversation today, I'd like to know, what are our next steps as an industry to address this challenge?
In addition to that, what about your next steps for science and innovation?
Love these questions to wrap us up. One of the biggest challenges remaining in the microplastic space is the same as in other sustainability applications. How do we increasingly improve the sustainable impact of products and conform with stricter regulations while meeting consumer pricing demands and leveraging existing waste infrastructure? Product innovation can and will address some of the next generation of circular economy challenges, but we need to, 1, pay increasing attention to consumer behaviors, 2, figure out how the increased costs may be managed, and 3, investigate the life cycle of a product to a fuller extent. A novel chemistry may not always be the best answer. Many mechanisms need to be in place to help prevent plastic waste in the environment, including improved recycling infrastructure and government support. It is important for industry to investigate improving the life cycle for existing product technologies and to leverage product innovation where appropriate.
Thank you, Jeanne, for that explanation. And also thank you both, Jennifer and Jeanne, for sharing the depth of your microplastics expertise. For our audience, we hope you join us on our next episode of Sustainability and Stewardship Matters in 2025.
For those of you interested in more information on dispersions and resins, we have links available to our BASF website and provided contact details for our product stewardship team. If you want to listen into previous Sustainability and Stewardship Matters podcast episodes, you can use the QR code or link to visit our Dispersions and Resins YouTube channel. For more information on microplastics or to ask Jeanne and her team a question, you can contact her at group-research-inquiries@basf.com. As always, we appreciate you listening to Sustainability and Stewardship Matters podcast.